Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Corinthians. Yesterday we began looking at chapter 7, in which Paul is talking about marriage and singleness. The first thing he dealt with was a false teaching that implied that it was more spiritual to be single than to be married. And Paul says that is not so. But simply live where God has placed you. If you're married, live in the fullness of your marriage. If you're single, well, then be happy being single. But live for the Lord, whatever your state might be. Now, there are some who read 1 Corinthians 7 and say, well, Paul had a preference for being single and seemed to encourage people not to marry. But I think that's a misunderstanding of what Paul said. Now, let me read to you a few verses. Verses 8 and following. Paul says, "Now to those who are not married and to those who are widowed, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I do." So some read that verse and think, well, Paul was single. He implied that he was not married. And so he's encouraging others to do the same. He finds that to be better. But that's not really what he said. He goes on to say, but if they cannot control themselves, well, then they should marry. For it is better to marry than to be consumed with passion. He also says, but to the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband. And if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. So see, Paul was not saying that it's better to be single than married. And those who imply that from 1 Corinthians 7 are simply incorrect. Paul is saying that he is single and that's working for him. So if you want to live a life of singleness, Paul says, that's okay. That's what I do. But if you're married, you should stay married and fulfill your life to the Lord in the midst of your marriage. Now, a little bit later, he makes an interesting comment that helps us understand all these things. We skip ahead to verse 29. And Paul says, for the sake of the kingdom, we live for Jesus Christ as first in our life. Verse 29, he says, what I mean, brothers and sisters, the time is short. So from now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not, and those who mourn as if they were not mourning, those who are happy as if they were not happy, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of this world as if they were not engrossed with them. For the world in its present form is passing away. So what Paul is saying simply is this. Our commitment is to eternal things, and all the things of this world are temporary. So whatever state you're in right now, be content right there. If you have the things of this world, be content with them, but don't be engrossed with them. If you don't have the things of this world, don't be obsessed with getting them. Just be happy with what you have. So if you're married, live in fullness in your marriage. If you're single, live fully as a single person. But wherever you are, whatever your state is, live for Jesus. So to the married folks, I say, live for Jesus. He's first in your life. To the single folks, I say, live for Jesus. He is first in your life. Whatever your state is in this world, live it for Jesus. So please don't let folks mislead you by saying Paul preferred singleness over marriage. He did not. He personally was single. He was fine with that. But he basically said, whatever state you were in, live in it for Jesus. Matter of fact, he says you should not even seek to change your status in this world as long as your status allows you to live for Jesus. That's what he says in verse 17 of the chapter. Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. Now, this is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? Well, he should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. So each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who is a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who is free when called is the slave of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of your human desires or of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when God called to them. So in other words, Paul is simply saying, whatever your status was when you became a Christian, and that applies to all things, be content in that place and live fully for God in that status. Whether married, whether single, whether circumcised, whether uncircumcised, doesn't matter. Whatever your status was when you were called, live fully for Jesus in that status. This is what Paul is saying in chapter 7, and this is the crux of the matter. We live fully for Jesus wherever we are. Hope you'll join us tomorrow as we continue our 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Corinthians.